Welcome to the Lapin Assessment. I'm extremely pleased to have with me this evening Dr. Dan Diker. He's the president of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs and the longtime director of its counter-political warfare project. Dan is also the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. He's a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University, and he's written 6 books exposing the apartheid anti-Semitism phenomena in North America. He's authored studies on Iran's race for regional supremacy and Israel's need for defensible borders, all of which we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm also pleased, as always, to have my co-host with me, Joseph Nickel, a reporter for the Canadian Jewish News. And Dan, I start these podcasts always with one question that I ask my guests, and that is, how are you this evening?
Thank you very much. Having just had dinner with my son, Michael, in Jerusalem, I feel very blessed to have loving children and to be in the middle of the Middle East, the capital of the Middle East, Jerusalem. So everything everything is relatively great. As my teacher, Professor Bernard Lewis of blessed memory, used to say, considering the alternatives, everything is just fine.
Yeah, that's always the perspective I try to adopt as well. I think it's the right way to look at life. Now, look, the elephant in the room, of course, is Iran, and we've got the U.S. assets that are almost completely in place now. The carrier strike groups, the fighter jet squadrons. We've got Israeli air defenses at the very highest level of alert. And I think the first thing that I'd be interested in getting your take on is, what do you think the decision-making process looks like in Washington right now? And how is Israel factoring into this process? What do you think is really happening? As much as possible behind closed doors. Of course, we can never know unless we're there. But I'd love to get your take, and from your very, very unique and expert vantage point, what are they weighing there? What are Trump's teams, his team members, what are they telling him? How do you see this playing out?
Well, Yaakov and Joseph, in most cases, we say the elephant in the room. In this case, we need to say the octopus in the room, because the Iranian regime is the octopus, many of whose tentacles have been amputated, been cut off by the United States, by Israel. Certainly since the major shift in the balance of power in the Middle East in September 2024, when Israel under Prime Minister Netanyahu really turned the tide and went on the offensive against this Iranian regime octopus, cutting off the tentacle in Lebanon by the Hezbollah, cutting off the Hamas tentacle, the one of two Sunni proxy tentacles, one being the Islamic Jihad, the other being Hamas, and leadership of both organizations were amputated. The major tentacle, Hezbollah, was severely degraded and really almost amputated completely. And then, right, of course, the Houthis, which is the Shiite, the Iranian regime Shiite proxy in northern Yemen, was also severely degraded, as well as some of the Iranian regime special forces, the Shiite special forces in Iraq. So the Iranian regime octopus has been severely wounded, and what still remains intact is the head of the octopus, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC in Tehran, as well as the Ayatollah leadership, or the brain, if we're going to stick with the analogy, the octopus brain, which is Ali Khamenei, the Ayatollah, and the elites, the elites in Qom, the religious elites. But now, having said that, the Iranian regime has never been in such a compromised, weak position since its establishment in 1979, when it took 444 days, 53 American hostages for 444 days, and announced that the United States, the great Satan, is now being kidnapped by the regime, and the regime's other goal is to destroy the little Satan, which is Israel, and
Yep.
it is really attempted to keep that promise. And we saw for the first time in April 2024, and then again in October 2024, the first ever direct assaults, military terror assaults by the Iranian regime against Israel, and that of course triggered a completely new and I would say upgraded national security imperative by Israel to prevent at all costs the Iranian regime not only from achieving nuclear supremacy, nuclear weapons capability, but the need for Israel to severely wound and downgrade its ballistic missile capabilities. And that's where we are right now, where we've reached a certain climax in that whole process.
Right.
Of where we are right now is whether the United States will take the decision to amputate to amputate the head of the Iranian octopus, that is clearly the number one supporter, driver, supplier, inciter of international terrorism. And that brings us to the decision point, to quote President George W. Bush's book, Decision Points, about where Israel is right now, together with the United States. I think what we do know is that there is a very, very high level of coordination and alignment between the United States and Israel. The leaders of both countries, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, have done very, very well together as allies. Prime Minister has been 6 times to the White House, far more than any other leader since President Trump's move into from January 20th, 2025 until today, about a year in the White House. And clearly Israel is in a very, very sensitive situation, in which, from what we understand, the president has made a commitment essentially to push towards the end of the Islamic Republic's regime, and allow the Iranian people a new future that is based on democracy, liberty, prosperity, and freedom and security, which they don't currently have. So it really, we're at a moment right now as we hold this discussion on our podcast between the three of us and many, many thousands and thousands of listeners and viewers, that we don't know exactly what decision President Trump will make. I think it's fair to assess that the United States, first of all, has committed more military firepower at this particular moment than at any other time in the Middle East towards one particular enemy since the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979. And I would suggest, and I'm sure it's not a far-reaching assumption, that the president would not have ordered so much military firepower to focus in one area, including major aircraft carrier, major scores of warplanes, other battleships, anti-aircraft and what they call anti-aircraft and anti-missile batteries in Israel, defenses. Jordan. Had he not had an intention to fulfill his promise to the Iranian people that help is on the way, and that he will destroy the Iranian regime if in fact they attempt in any way to continue to assault their own people. And we know that up to 30,000 Iranian people have been murdered in the streets across the Islamic Republic. It's about 150 cities, about 45, 50 districts, and more than 30,000 people. 500,000 people have been wounded by.
This would be, by the way, if these numbers are corroborated, this would be probably the single largest massacre in decades that we know of in a single night or over 2 days in recent history. I cannot remember 30,000 mostly unarmed people being wiped out in a massacre in a single night.
These are numbers like Babi Yar in Ukraine during World War II, something similar to that.
Yeah. So I guess,
Definitely.
the first of all, Dan, thank you so much for this comprehensive overview of where we are, because I think that's very useful to provide that overview. And it immediately brings two questions to mind. First of all, do you think that President Trump is still open to try to use all of this overwhelming force that he has surrounded the Islamic Republic with to try and get a deal? Are we looking at last minute, behind the scenes attempts to convince Khamenei and the IRGC leadership, look, if you want to avoid this firepower, now's the time. Give up your enrichment, give up your proxy program, which it's almost impossible to imagine them doing that. That's the first question. And the second question is, do you think it's possible to topple a regime from the air? In other words, will the Iranian people be willing to take that second step after the unspeakable, unimaginable crime against humanity that they have just absorbed? Will they be able to once again go out into the streets? Just those are two big questions. But whatever take you have on those, very very interested in hearing.
I think we might think about the first question: who really is trying to convince whom? I think it's fair to assess that the IRGC and under the instruction of Khamenei are trying to convince the Americans to do a deal, and that creates a lot of pressure on the president, because there are, from what we understand, there are sort of fellow travelers such as Special Envoy Witkoff and I think even Kushner and others who would be in favor of doing a deal under tremendous pressure by some of America's Arab allies, Qatar, Muslim allies, Turkey, and others, even the Saudis. The Saudis have gone back to diplomatic normalization with the Iranian regime, as extraordinary as that sound. And I had this conversation, since we have sort of an informal chat between the three of us and so many of our wonderful viewers tonight. I spoke with someone just yesterday who lives in Riyadh, who's very close to the royal court, and he emphasized the extent to which the Saudis really have re-engaged with the Islamic Republic's leadership in wanting to avoid any kind of bloodshed and continued armed conflict between the sides, which to me sounded absolutely unimaginable in view of the fact that the Saudis have looked historically at the Islamic Republic, at the regime, as severely as the United States or Israel had.
Sure.
And here, remember, the Chinese in 2024 have mediated this agreement, and those of us who are very skeptical, and I would assume that both you and Joseph also, expressed a degree of real skepticism to see that in the Arab Muslim world, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but the enemy of my enemy can still be my enemy. And and here you had this sort of bizarre reconciliation of sorts. And the Saudis are very much, certainly under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose vision for the Middle East is hyper focused on his 2030 vision for the Middle East, whereby the Saudis are the regional and even global superpower based in the Middle East. He has a wide-ranging, reform-driven, high-tech AI, massive transportation hub view of what Saudi could be and the Middle East could be. And he doesn't want to. He does not want to topple that apple cart, taking the chance with an American assault and some sort of Israeli cooperation on that. So what we're saying here is that there's a tremendous amount of domestic and international pressure on the President of the United States not to take military action.
Right.
So let's move to your second question, which is no less difficult to understand, to figure and assess than the first. And that is what we have seen in the Middle East from the U.S.-led allied assault against Saddam Hussein back in 1991 and then again in 2003, that it is virtually impossible to win a war from the air. Israel itself, in the Second Lebanon War, 2006, we were not able to, even notwithstanding the misinterpretation of our then chief of staff, Dan Khalutz, who was the chief of the Air Force. He was the head of the Air Force, and he thought that they could bomb, the Iranian proxies in Lebanon to smithereens, and therefore the Hezbollah regime would fall. No, it didn't happen. It can only happen really from the ground, and this is why this particular moment is different in Iran than any other moment, because it started by a groundswell of political activity by the Iranian people, who are willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of their own, throwing stones and having sort of very light weapons. Why? Because they have understood that President Trump and Netanyahu have their back. They saw what happened in June 2025, and they saw that Israel took action. Israel controlled the airspaces. Israel completely humiliated the regime by completely controlling their airspace, by bombing their nuclear program, by bombing their ballistic program, severely degrading the regime. And after having cut off the tentacles across the Middle East of the Iranian regime. So this inspired a ground political action of the Iranian people, and they continue to do that now, even though there are a lot of news reports that the regime has acted with such incredible cruelty in firing, going into people's homes and just shooting people in their beds. That things have sort of come down. But so the answer is no. I don't think that we can be confident that we can end the regime control from the air. It has to be done from the ground, but an air campaign certainly is an important part of that.
Right.
But it has to ultimately be done on the ground.
Right. Joseph, do you have any questions on the Iran issue before we move to?
Yeah, I just wanted to back up for 1 second to the Saudi-Iran rivalry. I mean, this is a rivalry that's been going on basically since 1979, since the regime came to power. So I just wanted to ask you, Dan, your take. What's in the strategic interest for the Saudis in the regime not being degraded or collapsing? What are the Saudis trying to preserve here? What's their strategic interest in a situation like that?
Well, I think that the Saudis are trying, under the Crown Prince, are trying to balance a number of different interests. One is just to maintain their perception of stability in the region. And I think their view is that if the United States leads a major military campaign against the regime, the regime is going to basically let all of their weaponry fly, and they may strike not only against the Al Udeid American Air Base near Doha in Qatar, but they may very well hit Gulf countries as well. And then all bets are off, and the perception is that the whole region gets dragged into this cataclysmic moment of unprecedented violence and instability, because let's face it, the forces in the Middle East, across the Middle East, you basically have radical Islamists all over the place, and then you have the establishment, more moderate forces that want stability and security. So organizations like Al-Nusra, the Sunni radical organizations in Syria, Hamas is all over the region. Hezbollah still has a lot of firepower. The Houthis still have lots and lots of missiles and drones and other opportunities to subvert and destabilize the region. That is what the Saudis are most concerned about, is the constant subversion and destabilization of the region. That's one of the reasons, by the way, just as an historical note, that the Saudis have always despised the PLO since the 1970s, because they saw Arafat, as the major subverter of the Middle East. So take Arafat and multiply it by 100 on steroids, and that is the concern that the Saudis have right now about toppling the Islamic regime apple cart.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think that the Saudis made a decision. I'm not sure exactly when, but I think they made a decision, and MBS seems to have led this decision to hedge their bets and to try and achieve basically threat management from Iran through diplomacy rather than military force. I think a lot of things contributed to that, including the former Biden era arms embargo that was placed on the Saudis when they were fighting the Houthis in Yemen, and lots of other factors, probably domestic as well. But at some point, I think Riyadh made the decision that they're going to hedge their bets and bet on diplomacy and de-escalation. I don't think they've changed by a millimeter their threat perception of Tehran, but I think that the public diplomacy is aimed at really just trying to decrease the chances of, just as Dan said here, of Iran firing missiles at them. And
there's one other component, Yaakov and Joseph, that we didn't mention, and that is that Mohammed bin Salman, particularly as of 2 years ago, when he when he had an international conference in Riyadh, is basically understood to be the leader of the Arab Muslim world,
right?
1,600,000,000 people, and he has that as a constraint. And if remember, the street identifies as much with the West, with a Western assault on what they see as the Islamic Republic, as an assault against Islam, as anything else. So he understands that he has to keep in mind the public reaction of the Arab and Muslim street across the Middle East and even across the world. So he's got a lot of customers to handle there in the 1,600,000,000 public that he represents, and that is a constraint that has really guided his thinking away from immediate talk and action of normalization with Israel, because and the Hamas knows this. The Hamas knows it. The Islamic regime knows it. That the last thing in the world they want is to create or allow normalization, stability, security to take place in the Middle East.
For sure. And let's remember that the Saudis gained their legitimacy in the wider Muslim world by presenting themselves as the custodians of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. So I totally agree with that. One last question on Iran.
I also have one last question for both of you, actually.
Okay, so I'll fire mine off, and Joseph, you fire yours off, and we'll see where this goes.
Sounds good.
What about an oil embargo enforced by the Navy? Maybe that would, because if this instability began with economic collapse, we don't have to mention all of the ways that the Iranian economy collapsed now, but it has collapsed. Wouldn't an oil embargo do more to further destabilize the regime than any airstrike? Dan, what do you think about that?
Well, I do know that, I think we all know that there has been a lot of talk about an oil embargo. And this is one of the reasons I think that that Israel has recognized Somaliland in a very surprise move, because they sit very strategically, on the Gulf of Aden and on the Bab el-Mandeb choke point, where a lot of that oil, where a lot of the world's energy supply passes. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's between 15 and 20% of the world's energy supply passes through that, that choke point into the Red Sea. So that would sort of begin to explain Israel's decision unilaterally and uniquely to recognize the Republic of Somaliland after it's been independent for some 35 years. So that's a sort of long windup into your question. As yes, a boycott is always possible, but one shudders to think what that will do to oil prices, right in the West. So I think, so I think that's a real factor, especially now in which President Trump is facing a very difficult climb up the domestic mountain in the United States, especially with his controversial contretemps, if you will, with or tackle with Jerome Powell and the Fed. I think people abroad, where we are in Jerusalem and around the world, do either underemphasize or are not sufficiently aware of how problematic his domestic situation is. His numbers, his approval numbers are low in the United States, even though I think many of us abroad who are watching what he did at Davos just a few days ago I called him, I've referred to President Trump as the great international destroyer and the great international rebuilder simultaneously. He's completely dismantled the international system as it existed, and he's rebuilding it, as an economic warrior on the basis of economic interest and power that fuels a political influence around the world. So I think that our tendency from where we sit is to see President Trump in extraordinary and I think positive, many positive through positive glasses, and while at the same time he knows that his domestic situation is far more complex, perhaps than his greater popularity in the Middle East. I think if he were running for president of the Middle East, he'd be elected hands down by the majority of the Middle East, but not necessarily so in the United States.
Sure. I mean, there's a significant wing or significant sphere on the right in the United States that's very staunchly anti-interventionist, isolationist. Definitely. I wanted to ask one more question back to Iran. Sorry, I can't move on from the topic. What's some of the calculus going on now? I mean, it's hard to interpret, what's going on in their minds, but what's some of the calculus in the minds of the Ayatollah senior leadership? I mean, you see them on social media making all these bellicose comments, and I saw today a picture of a billboard somewhere, maybe downtown Tehran, depicting some kind of strike on U.S. military assets. So again, kind of a belligerent depiction. What's going on? I mean, but their backs are against the wall. It's kind of like a bleeding animal. What are some of the calculations going on in their mind? What's their end game here?
And just before you tackle that, I'm going to throw in an observation. My guess is that the Iranian strategy is to try and nudge Trump into the most minimal strike option that's currently being presented to him on the spectrum. Because what they're saying is, if you want to hit and run, this is their poker face. If you think you're going to do a targeted strike and walk away, we're not Venezuela. We're going to unleash. Now, whether they'll actually do that is anybody's guess. But I think that they're actually trying to deter Trump based on his known aversion to entanglement. So they're threatening large-scale responses to whatever happens. That's the poker face, and I don't know if their bluff is going to be called or not. Over to you, Dan.
Well, I think that's a very important observation. And I mean, let's remember Ali Khamenei and his puppets. Remember back the Ahmadinejad puppet back in 20 years ago. They were talking. I mean, Professor Bernard Lewis says that the former idea of mutual deterrence between the Soviet Union and the United States does not work in a messianic regime whose eschatology would militate towards the end of day scenario. So Professor Lewis used to call it their desire for a short route to heaven by letting everything fly and sacrificing themselves as jihadists, as shahidim, the martyrs. For the sake of their view, messianic view of radical Islam, and also in a way to trigger the return of the Mahdi, of the hidden imam in occultation, and to trigger that. So there really is an open question as to how realistic do they become realistic, or if they think that the regime can still survive. Or are they just basically going to go down and take everyone down with a ship? This is definitely something to think about. But clearly, clearly Ayatollah Khamenei is terrified that it could be over.
Yep, I share that assessment. I think, and he's got good reason to be. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, so let me pivot us to Gaza. And the question in my mind about Gaza is this. When it comes to Iran, it seems to me that there's no daylight whatsoever between Washington and Jerusalem. There might be a very minute sort of tactical discussions about what the best way to go forward is, but really seems like President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the U.S. military, the IDF, everybody understands, just as Dan has been saying all along, head of the tentacle. This is the engine behind the jihadist proxy machine in the Middle East. And the sooner this falls, the better it is for absolutely everybody, not just regionally, but globally. In Gaza, we seem to be having some kind of disagreement about the priority that needs to be given, the time that needs to be given for diplomacy, for disarming Hamas in what they called stage 2. Israel is deeply skeptical that this is actually going to happen, but we've also got Qatar and Turkey sort of whispering in the ears of the Trump administration saying, give this a chance, we can get achievements, you got all the hostages back, look how far we've come. And there seems to be a diplomatic tug of war. So my question to you, Dan, is first of all, do you think there is real daylight, or is this orchestrated? And behind the scenes, there are quiet agreements that there is a deadline, there are criteria, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is willing to give this a chance, and the disagreements we've been hearing about are not so drastic? Or do you think that there's actual tension, diplomatic tension, over the future of Gaza between Washington and Jerusalem?
I think there's good reason to believe that it's all true. I mean, which is probably not an answer you want to hear, but let's take a view that is based on the fact that Netanyahu is headed towards elections, and he has to maintain legitimacy among his own base. And so many in his base, in the coalition, say, over my dead body, would Israel agree, A, to let Hamas stay in power, B, to move to stage 2 before stage 1 is completed, which is just today. As we have this podcast, we have confirmation that the body of Ron Gavili has been located and brought back to Israel. And that was a critical development for Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he has agreed, in order just to follow your line of thinking, Yaakov, to go with President Trump's and the administration's pressure to open the Rafah crossing, which is a vitally and sensitive crossing that is the only crossing that is not directly connected to an Israeli entry and exit point. So that, the three of us know, the Rafah crossing has been thus far, for the last number of years, a highway of terror and a highway for illegal, all kinds of illegal materiel and weapons and trucks and you name it, coming from Egypt, into the Gaza Strip, and in places that Israel was not able to enforce the security measures that it today insists on enforcing, if in fact, and the cabinet, the Israeli government cabinet, did approve this opening of the Rafah crossing. Now, this goes to your assessment, Yaakov, because Netanyahu, in an ideal world, would never approve such a move. But I think it's fair to assess that there is a deal here, which is called essentially the Iranian regime for Gaza, or Gaza for the Iranian regime. Now, let's bear in mind, and we only have a few minutes, that today Israel's military position in Gaza is the best it's been since 2005 August, September, when Israel pulled out unilaterally from the Gaza Strip under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And it's been 21 years, and today, for the first time in that period, Israel does have defensible borders in the Gaza Strip, because we have this massive buffer zone called, we control, right, 53 to 55% of the Strip. So we have that strategic depth that we never had before, so that Netanyahu knows at the end of the day he can take calculated risks in Gaza that he was not able to take before. And if, in fact, the Mar-a-Lago summit proves true, and the two leaders who complemented each other in the most exaggerated way, indicates to me that there is, that the changing of the guard, if you will, in Iran is the major objective, not only of Netanyahu, but that he's prevailed upon Trump to do that. Netanyahu, as we know him, has been obsessively focused on ending the regime's existence since the 90s. And especially when he addressed the joint houses of Congress in the United States at the age of 46, I think just a few months after he took power, after he won the elections, he said, it's the Iranian regime. It's the Iranian regime. That is the key to understanding regional instability. And many people in the assembly looked at each other like, well, wait a second, isn't the Palestinian issue the major destabilizing force? Now we're talking about 1996, which is 3 years after Oslo was signed, and the buses were blowing up.
Yep.
And so everyone thought in the West, most everyone thought, that the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as it was then called, continues to be called, unfortunately, and I think mistakenly, because we're not in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where we're facing jihad in the West and jihad in Israel.
Totally agree.
But they think that that was the problem, right? So so again, and Netanyahu has focused obsessively on ending the Islamic regime's existence as the purveyor, supplier, inciter, and director of international terrorism across the Middle East and across the world, Africa and in the West. So I think that's the deal with Gaza. We will go along with Gaza. We'll figure it out later. Let's take care of the major problem, which is the Islamic Republic's leadership.
Fascinating analysis, Dan. And I have to say that this is the second time that I've heard a guest on this podcast put forward the idea that there is such a deal. We also had in the last episode Professor Kobi Michael, who is exactly of your view. He put forward a very, very similar hypothesis, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It explains a lot of what we're seeing. Joseph, do you have any final questions? We're almost out of time completely. Both of you, I know, have to run. So do you have any last questions?
I have a million questions, but we don't have time.
we will have to cap it here because I know you both have to run. Dan, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and I'm sure fascinating for our viewers who, as you note, are absolutely growing in number, and I'm very pleased to recognize that. Thank you so much. I hope that we will have you back sooner rather than later. And thanks to you, Joseph, as always, again.
Sure. Thank you both very much. I enjoyed every minute of it, and thank you to your viewers for watching and the podcast, which I know has gained a tremendous following, and very justifiably so. So I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.